Okay, so OpenAI just dropped their GPT 5.2. And this thing takes the benchmark game to a whole new level that we haven't seen before. This literally beats Gemini 3 Pro on every benchmark out there. Not only that, it's state of the art on AGI 1, and it's crazy impressive on ARC-AGI 2 with a new best score. But more importantly, it puts OpenAI back at the top of the frontier labs. Now, here's a very impressive example that they have put together of rendering ocean wave simulation in a single HTML file, which is pretty impressive. Now, for me personally, I'm interested in the coding, and it is really pushing the frontier when it comes to coding. On Sweetbench Pro, this is not the Sweetbench Verified. This is creating a new state of the art, and seems like it's able to preserve the model performance as the number of output tokens improves. This is not the case with the previous GPT 5.1 family. That tends to decrease the performance as you increase the number of tokens. Now, with all the talk around benchmarks, there is still one benchmark on which it's not at top of the leaderboard, and that is the Web Dev Arena leaderboard from LM Arena. So here on it right now, GPT 5.2 is at the second position in the high setting, but when you bring it down to the normal, it drops to the sixth position, which is still pretty impressive, but seems like it's not as good as Opus 4.5 on this specific leaderboard. Okay, there seems to be a GPT 5.2 Pro as well. They don't really have any details on the benchmarks, but I would assume this is equally impressive. However, we have some very interesting information on this page. So I'm comparing it with GPT-5, 5.2, and then 5.2 Pro. It seems like GPT 5.2 actually supports image output, which is new. After GPT-4, this is the first OpenAI model that is supporting native image output, although they haven't mentioned this in their blog post. Now, it's a bit more expensive compared to 5, but if you look at 5.2 Pro, takes the cost to a whole different level. So this is definitely not for casual work. It's geared most towards a lot more professional and economically viable work. Now, the training cutoff date also is very recent, so August 31st. Seems like they did another pre-training run along with some really impressive post-training. For most of the previous models, the knowledge cutoff date was September 30th, 2024, and that's when they did their final pre-training run. But now they have a completely new pre-trained base model, which probably is going to be used for subsequent post-training runs that we're going to see in the future. So all the news about OpenAI lagging behind probably is not true anymore. Now, here's a quick comparison of different benchmarks that were reported by OpenAI compared to Opus 4.5 and Gemini 3 Pro. And if you look at GPT 5.2 thinking, it's simply state of the art on every benchmark out there. So with this release, they're really focusing on GPT 5.2 ability to unlock more economic value for people. In a recent study, they showed that AI saves about 40 to 60 minutes a day for enterprise users. And with this release, they're really pushing this narrative of AI creating economic value. One of the benchmark that OpenAI created is this GDP wall, where it outperforms industry professionals at a well-specified knowledge work task spanning 44 different occupations. And it's the first model that is actually showing economically viable output. And it's a huge leap over GPT 5.1. Now, this is specifically designed at general intelligence, long context understanding, and agentic tool calling and vision. In my opinion, code is all you need. If you get really good at coding, most of these other capabilities are going to come along. Now, the good thing is that you don't really see any chart crimes in this blog post or in the release, which is pretty great. Now, they are highlighting some capabilities which will be useful for professional work, especially in economically viable tasks. And now it can create a spreadsheet and much better presentation compared to the previous iteration. And this is going to be available to the paid plan. Now, we have seen these capabilities with other frontier models like Gemini 3 Pro and also Opus 4.5. And in all honesty, I would say that irrespective of whichever provider you choose, they really have very capable models at this point. They are just probably 1 or 2 points ahead of each other on different benchmarks. However, the real power is the applications that you build on top of these models. Now, a few other interesting things. So this one has much less hallucinations compared to the previous iterations. So for example, for GPT 5.1 thinking, it had a hallucination rate of 8.8%. Now there's a almost 30% reduction. So this model has a hallucination rate of 6.2%. It is a context window of 4,000 or 400,000 tokens. It seems like it is really good at long contexts. So one of the benchmarks that they have mentioned here is this OpenAI MRCR version 2. And now in this iteration, they are trying to retrieve 4 different needles. So it's a variation of the famous needle in the haystack problem. But if you look at GPT-5 thinking, its capability to retrieve those 4 needles decreases substantially as you increase the number of tokens in the context window. But for the GPT 5.2 thinking, it's actually pretty consistent. Now, if it actually holds true in real world, this is significant improvement, because if you go to even about 256,000 tokens, it still preserve up to 98% retrieval performance. Now, needle in the haystack is not a representative of real world, but 4 needles in a haystack is a lot more complex compared to a single needle. And this definitely is going to translate to real world applications, hopefully. But if you increase the needles to 8 instead of 4, you can see some degradation in performance. So at 256,000 tokens, it drops to 70%, but still it's more than twice that of the GPT 5.1. Now, if you overall look at this release, you're going to see a consistent theme. Even though it's a small version bump compared to the previous 5.1, it's a huge leap in performance. Okay, so on vision, they say that it's our strongest vision model yet, cutting error rate roughly in half on chart reasoning and software interface understanding, right? So there are again some benchmarks which shows that it's a leap ahead of GPT 5.1 thinking. Now, interestingly enough, even though in the model card it mentions that it has image output, there is not much information available about image output on this blog post. But it has definitely much better image understanding capabilities. So if you look at the output from 5.1 compared to 5.2, it's able to label a lot more elements present in this circuit board, although the resolution of the input image is pretty bad, but still it does a really impressive job. Now, we can look at some of the other benchmarks as well, but the main story is going to be whether this is going to perform on a similar scale on real world tasks or not. Okay, so this is going to be available in ChatGPT starting today. There are 3 different variations. One is GPT 2.5 Instant, which is a fast and capable workhorse for everyday work and learning. And then there is GPT 5.2 Thinking, which is designed for deeper work, helping user tackle more complex tasks. So this is probably the one that a lot of people are going to be focusing on. And then there is the most expensive GPT 2.5 Pro, which they say is our smartest and most trustworthy option for difficult questions where a higher quality answer is worth the wait. Now, they also specifically highlighted safety, which is a very important topic, especially that ChatGPT might be enabling some adult content towards the end of the year or maybe early next quarter. This again shows much better performance compared to the previous iteration. Okay, so at the end, I think it's worth a look at the benchmarks again, because it tells you that most of these benchmarks are pretty much saturated at this point. And these model providers are really competing for 1 point, half a point, or 2 points improvement in some cases. But the most interesting thing is that even though this new GPT 5.2 is beating all the other frontier models by quite a bit of a margin, they still went with a minor version upgrade instead of calling it something like GPT 5.5. So this kind of shows you that OpenAI might have a lot more in stock for us. Now, another important benchmark is the ARC-AGI benchmark. And this really shows a very important trend that test time compute is playing a very critical role. And with this new model, it has basically solved ARC-AGI 1. Specifically, GPT 5.2 Pro is getting about 90%. The ARC-AGI team posted this a year ago. We verified a preview of an unreleased version of OpenAI O3 High that scored 88% on ARC-AGI 1 at $4.5 thousand per task. Today, we verified a new GPT 5.2 Pro HX, which is getting 90% at $11 per task. And we are looking at almost 2 order of magnitudes cost reduction. Now, there was a huge controversy around this initial model that solved 98 or 88%. That's a story for a different video. They say that they also verified GPT 5.2 Pro High on ARC-AGI 2, scoring 54.2 for $15.72 per task. Now, the previous best non-OpenAI model from a proprietary frontier lab was Gemini 3 Pro, which is about 33% or 32%. But this is close to 80-85% improvement, which is crazy, given that ARC-AGI 2 is supposed to be a very hard benchmark. So here's Noam Brown from OpenAI. He says an important lesson that ARC-AGI has internalized, but not many others have, is that the benchmark performance is a function of test time compute. So OpenAI publishes standalone evals because it's simpler and people won't expect to see it, but ideally all evals would have an x-axis. And he's specifically talking about the cost associated with running different experiments, which has dropped substantially even for this specific benchmark, right? So it actually shows you that these models are becoming more and more economically viable now. Now, this was a quick video on some of my initial thoughts with this model release. There's going to be a more detailed video on actually testing this model. So if you're interested in that, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Anyways, do let me know how your experience with this model looks like. Thanks for watching. And as always, see you in the next one.